We're so happy to talk about this unrelenting change and how we transition. Is it a fact, and so many of us are exposed to change and we don't transition successfully?
That is true. And that's why sometimes you can look back in time and go, well, how did I get through that? And that's what we're going to explain, what you have done and what we can work on today.
Yeah, and speaking of working on stuff, we have been impacted by unrelenting change, and we're faced with so many things. How often in our human journey have we been faced with change that affects us on a global, national, provincial, local, workplace, home life, relationship, and personal level? Every level is being affected.
Yeah, it's real, and it's happening to people all over the world. And considering our current climate right now, you can take any one of those things and say, okay, it's hard to find a Canadian who has not endured or has the challenge of what we're looking at on the screen.
Yes, so those items on the screen are so important. And because you're not all in a big room together, just pick a couple that have affected you and type them in the chat room so the others that are with us today can see, so we know we're not alone. And we'll talk about COVID stress syndrome in another moment.
Yeah, or has affected your family. You don't have to say it personally, but just affected your world around you because it's affected your home life so much.
Yeah, and if we look at somebody with existing mental health issues or this closeness distancing cycle, what is that about, Ange? Do you want to mention that one?
Well, this one is hard for people to understand because it's like we're living in the same house, so I'm glad that Jim's here, right? But at the same time, that's the only person I see. And then sometimes you get a little bit irritable.
The happy face, sad face.
Yeah, and we're like, okay, like I love you so much, but gosh, I'm sick of you.
So when I get some distance, or Angela gets distance from me.
And is it fair to say most people feel that way? It's normal.
Most
right?
people feel that way. It's normal. And then you take that time away, sometimes a half an hour, sometimes a walk, sometimes a shift at the fire station that I take. And we feel less abrasiveness from that closeness we've had to sometimes endure.
Yeah, exactly. And people have had this kind of like that familiar feeling like, oh no, like I feel like I'm trapped, or their family rhythm for sure has been off or different or changed, or have they transitioned?
Have they transitioned? What a great question. And we know that one of the mentions there is the COVID stress syndrome. This is becoming known well. And thank you for chiming in the chat room. Keep doing this.
So is impactful.
Yeah, we're going to talk. That's okay. This is something part of our closeness cycle. We talk over each other from time to time.
That's what we do, and we need to stop.
But we love talking about the COVID stress syndrome because we know it's real. The whole presentation is not about that, but we need to let you know that's part of our current change that needs us to be intentional about transition, which we're going to use the word intentional quite a bit, I think.
Yes, because it is based on intention. But when we do, this is now a syndrome that is impacting people all over the globe. And it was researched in Regina, here in our own little home prairie of Saskatchewan. And it has to do with traumatic stress, xenophobia, socioeconomic concerns, danger and contamination fears, and then constant checking and reassurance seeking is what people are really kind of challenged with. They feel like, like I don't hear enough of what's going on around the world, or I don't hear enough of what I need to know
to keep myself safe, which is part of that traumatic stress in these 5 interrelated facets on the COVID stress syndrome. And as you've mentioned, our Regina researchers, it was Gary Asbjornson and his team that they recognized the concern was real. They did the research, and now it's accepted internationally as a legitimate stress syndrome. And people have exposed to this traumatic stress ongoing and almost a subpalpable level, but it's been ongoing. And then xenophobia is one that's hard to understand until we started to see these new variants again.
Yeah, and then people are more anxious, or they become more concerned about people coming from other countries and giving these variants.
Yeah, we heard people, Ange, say to us when the first variant was recognized in the UK, I hope people aren't flying in from the UK here.
Yeah.
So it's about that.
It's about that, not specifically a race of people, which xenophobia has usually been tied to, right? It's really, that's what they're talking about in that component.
Yeah, and these things lead to people to have really dire results sometimes. People are more inclined to have anxiety and depression, to panic buying, which started up again when there was a lockdown coming.
Yeah.
Self-isolation, distress. It doesn't feel good to be in self-isolation, does it?
No, it doesn't. And then those things wreak havoc in our brains. Our brains are trying to find this comfort, this certainty. And so we're doing what we can in order to give our brains some certainty. That's what's really going on when we see this COVID stress syndrome.
And who's not avoiding public places now? Avoidance behaviors are normal when we're in a situation where serious change is taking place. Yeah. But as we transition out of it, are people going to still want to avoid interacting with other humans?
Well, I think if the person is living with a health condition that is on an autoimmune condition or anything like that, or has people in their life that they are very vulnerable, then yes, that's going to affect family systems that way.
Yeah, and we can't minimize that this change is only one in many that you'll be exposed to in the future and have been exposed to when you consider your past. And we now have a choice. This is beautiful that when we're exposed to change, we can either transition or there's potential that we enter in a transition crisis.
Yeah, and that's what happens. So change is inevitable. We know this, but transition is intentional. So there's some choices and some power we can give back to our brains who feel like there's no control.
Yeah, without intention, we might end up in that crisis, Ange, that we're referring to here. And we're going to talk in a moment about what transition crisis is, because it's nonstop. And a quick look at that, we find transition crisis is easy to define. We know the difference between change and transition. Let's take a look at that. What's a change?
Well, change is the shift, right? It's a shift in the external situation. That's what happened to us all, right? But transition is an intentional reorientation that we need in order to respond to the change well.
You said it again, intentional. We got to be intentional. We've been in change. We're going to be in more. Let's be intentional, or we might end up in this, folks. And the crisis is a life event that an individual perceives as stressful. So when we say perceive, we're not minimizing it. It still is real.
It's real for them.
And the perception is reality, as we've heard for years.
Yeah.
As a stressful, it's so stressful to the extent that our normal coping mechanisms, what happens?
Well, they're not sufficient enough. We didn't go into this pandemic with a very healthy, mentally or physically society. Healthy.
So true.
So are we going to end up better? That's a question we're still waiting on.
Yeah, that's a $1 billion question now, because knowing what transition crisis is in a unsuccessful response to change, it's the effect on you, your organization, society, when the process of adaptation to change is disrupted.
Or it results in distress, right? Some of those changes, we will all be subject to change no matter what, right? There's DNA changes that happen evolutionarily with a person being born into the world, right? Yeah. But will we be architects of transition? That's where we get a say in.
And if we consider what an architect is, now you folks many of you worked with architects in your work in providing safety out there for all of us. And an architect is a very unique individual that if we can be the architect of our change towards transition, we then will have many things in place. Will we have a plan?
Yes.
Yeah. Will there be intention?
Yes. Will we understand the infrastructure needed in order to build the framework for that architectural structure? Will
we build off past architectural feats we've accomplished?
Probably. Yeah. We'll use that to our benefit, that knowledge, right? So why can't we use this to our benefit and knowledge?
And does an architect, Ange, understand the barriers as well when they're putting a beautiful edifice together?
Yes, they understand the environment. They understand all of the systems involved in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, and it results for you, if you're an architect of transition from the change you're exposed to, it results in some really nice stuff. But the process itself, we know it appears to be an ancient psychological mechanism.
Yeah. And so the ancients knew this, and they knew that operates in every culture. And so a natural time cycle is 6 to 12 months to actually work through and go, okay, this is our new normal. And anybody who's had a death in the family knows that there's a different kind of normal that happens after that person leaves our family, right?
And yeah, that 6 to 12 months is a really good reference. We'll take a real thoughtful look at that right away, but great reference to think of somebody who loses somebody that first year, which is 12 months.
Yeah.
Or a honeymoon phase.
Is where they're really saying, they're not really saying it, but what they're doing is they're going through a transition. How do I do this without that? How do I do this without that person? How? It's the question of how.
And the time lag we're talking about, this 6 to 12 months, it's not expected, which is a problem because most of us, we might be in what feels like a crisis now, and we think it's our current thing that's going on that's causing crisis, when in fact the crisis is likely related to that past situation.
Yeah. And so now what we're looking at is, again, survival mechanisms, simply stated as the F3 response that has evolved to equip us to cope with danger. The transition cycle enables humans to adapt after a trauma and to change, enhancing our potential to avoid crisis.
So we'll ask you to start thinking now about some of the changes that have occurred in you, your family members, your life, your world, your work, and consider, how did I transition?
Yeah.
Did I do it intentionally and thoughtfully and end up successful, or was there distresses along the way?
What had to be in place for that to be successful, in the sense that it was a good adaptation? So simply stated, transition crisis is what?
Yeah, so mental and emotional distress. It's got negative impacts due to lots of change, resulting in what we're calling an unsuccessful transition.
Yeah. And Di Williams from the UK, he's the one who's researched this, and he's understood it from various angles, from different world wars that the globe had to readjust and transition from.
Yeah.
So this is not unlike that, where systems are down, or we had to change the way we live and work and move in society.
So that's what transition crisis is, team. And if you have questions, you can throw them in the chat now. George will alert us to the ones that are relevant to what we're just talking about. But as we go through the material, they may pop up. You can put a question in any time, and we'll address them at the end of our talk if we don't do it along the way.
Yeah. So we want to know, what is adapting? Adapting?
Yeah,
adapting. For a successful transition.
Sure.
What are the 2 levels we need in order to lead to a transition that's good?
We have to know we need behavioral adaptation and cognitive restructuring. The first one we find is easy for us as humans, right? So as humans, we want to say, okay, some change has occurred. I've behaved a little differently. I don't know if it's adapting, but have I thought about those adaptations?
Yeah. Did I think, or did I just survive? That's the part we get to do as humans, because we have metacognition at our disposal.
Yeah, you're a bunch of metacognators is what I'm just saying, which means what? Means
humans who think about their thoughts. So if we think about our thoughts, have I thought about my behavioral adaptations? What do I do when I have a problem? What do I do? Like, I know Einstein, let's take him for instance. He used to walk miles and miles every day to kind of ponder his theory that he was building upon, right? So he would walk and meditate, but also he was transitioning.
Right.
He was adapting what he thought in his mind could be possible in real life.
And likely thinking about the behaviors when he was exposed to change. Now, he brought a lot of change.
But how did he do that? He did that by including his body and his mind together in one unit, and said, okay, this is where I do my best work.
So you look, and you look at these creatures on screen right now. The dandelion is that picture in the background, the birds on the tree. So let's pick the birds out. Do they have to think about what they're doing when change occurs to transition, or what happens?
No, their DNA takes over, and it's built in, right? We have some built-in DNA for transition simply by being human being on the planet. But for the creatures of the earth, they don't have that metacognition. So they don't set up a framework. They don't set up, okay, this is how I'm going to do this. It
just happens.
What happens when trauma or distress happens to something in the creature world, animal kingdom?
So if trauma or distress happens, their biology adapts. And if they don't adapt, what happens to them? They die. So that's why we're so privileged to have that metacognition, which we're going to talk about for a minute in our steps towards cognitive restructuring. So these steps are, first of all, we identify and acknowledge how we're feeling. Who likes change here?
Not me, but it depends how much, right? So people who used to say, I love change, they're like, okay, I had my fill. Thank you very much. But identifying and acknowledging the feeling, whatever it is in the moment.
And add to it with this next step.
Resist the judgment. So we tend as human beings to judge our feelings, right? And we judge other people's feelings too, right? Because we're raised that way. Is it society telling us? Is it socialization, or is it our own brain?
Well, and humans have a wonderful built-in aptitude to judge things outside of ourselves so that we can provide safety for ourselves, whether it's safe or not. We also judge others in comparison. But yeah, I think what you're saying is so true. We judge ourselves, most of us, harder than anyone else. So when we acknowledge that I'm really not comfortable or happy with this change, it's hard, I feel crappy, I can resist judging that.
Yeah. So what feeling was there that could you take a more clinical look at yourself? And that is what I've been charged to do with. In a lot of my learning throughout the time. And one of my mentors said, if you can't look at it and resist the feeling of judgment, then you can't go further.
Well, and as a human,
and that made sense to me.
And that mentor knew the value of identifying self as a human, right? Where I think that's kind of what you're saying with being a clinical. I'm a human. This is a human thing. I'm going to be real and resist judging it. So what category is it in? So over a year, we've all seen categories of loss and injustice and relationship change or conflict, perhaps. Safety is always a concern, and then uncertainty. How much uncertainty can I actually live comfortably with? And the next one is identify what type of control you have, and be intentional is the last, about making decisions. We want to identify those two together, because when we feel like we have no control, it's a threat to you as a human. The human condition has a stress response, and we have kind of a limit on our creativity to move through it. We might go in survival mode. So if we identify a piece of control we had, like when the last big change happened in our family, the control we had was to clean the garage. That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
Right?
And that's how we think, right? Like sometimes people think better when they're cleaning, or so just acknowledging, oh, I think better when I'm cooking or baking. Or a lot of people were doing things because their brain couldn't catch up with all of the information. And did it have a pandemic file? No. But am I going to build one? And have I started building one? Yes. Because all the things that I don't know, of the uncertainties, go in that pandemic file. Because when I'm awake during the day, my brain's collecting all these toxins. And so my F3 response, the fight, flight, or freeze syndrome, wants to take over. But instead, I follow these steps and say, okay, I'm going to cognitively restructure here by identifying that feeling, resist judging it, just acknowledge it's there. Yeah. It's there. I'm jealous of people who get to go on holidays right now. And that's a fact. I don't have to tell the world, even though I told you. But inside, I can say, okay, that's the real feeling. Now what?
Now what? And that real feeling points you to be a real human, and you identify, now what? Do I have control? So the real feeling many of us had when we started to have lockdown, isolation, mask requirements was, man, I don't like this, but it's because we had no control. So what we've learned through research on people's anxiety levels is those of us, and I say us because I was a bit of a resistor before it was mandatory, to be honest with you. Didn't want to wear a mask. But once people complied with the requests of society to make us all feel safe, those people's anxiety levels went down. They had some control. They were intentional about making a decision. When change is in front of us or upon us, if we want to transition successfully, we have to find small decisions to make that give us that sense of control back.
Yeah, because didn't that allow your brain to kind of rest?
It's like my brain took a breath.
Yeah, and say, okay, I can choose to be compliant.
Sure.
And I could choose to do that, or I can choose not to.
Yeah.
We still have choices to make, but is it easier on your brain?
It's
just
easy.
Go, you know what? And to the point in the question in the chat room, how do you deal with resistance from others while trying to make a transition specifically in the workplace? That's where we need a little bit more collective unity, right? Because if we're seeing this happen here and we're seeing that happen there, then we're like, okay, can some transition in workplaces be met without resistance? That's the question we are asking companies. Can you team up, and can it be met with less resistance? And then if it isn't, then acknowledge and identify the feeling of why that's such a threat, right? Because our amygdala is, scanning for threat all the time.
Yeah, 2/3 of your neurons in your amygdala are designed to identify threats outside of you.
Yeah. And so all we can do is say, okay, and what category does that land in for that person? What is the resistance? Why does it land so hard in that category? And then, because there's some association the brain's made to feeling like, oh no, they're going to take all my freedom away, or they're going to take whatever that is. It's a scary feeling for that person who is resisting. And that's what they're responding with, is fear. Right?
And the fear leads to, we've heard it said, it's a competition of ideas in many workplaces where Angela and I disagree on a process of transition that needs to take place. Give you the right, you're the correct one, more accurate. So you're trying to impose that correctness, in my view too, but is it possible that Angela could say, well, Jim, what's your suggestions for us to transition successfully from the change, like the new SAP that's just been implemented? So asking your colleagues, can we team up and come up with a strategy? And likely when a meeting of the minds get together, the most accurate and best way percolates to the top.
It's true. And I mean, was it easy for me? Yes, because I live with 2 autoimmune conditions. So I chose to be compliant a long time ago.
Thank you for the question.
That's a great question.
So those are 5 steps to cognitive restructuring you can employ to transition successfully. But what should we know about resources? Do you have another add-in before we talk about the resources?
Yeah, I just want to add in, it works with every person on the planet. True. It works with children. It works for everyone if we do this. And what it requires is honesty. Yeah. Sincerity and truth.
Yeah. What I'm not comfortable about, what I feel threatened about, what I'm afraid about, what I don't understand, what I'm confused about.
Yeah.
If we can know those things of self, we can transition successfully as well.
Yeah. And just understanding, I don't want to wear a mask. I don't want to do that. But am I going to? Yes. That's a choice.
Yeah, have you ever encountered anyone that said, I really like wearing a mask? It just doesn't happen.
Clowns. Yeah. That's why they paint their face, because they don't want to wear a mask.
So the humans in the room need to know this, Ange, about absorbing change and transition. As humans, what does it do?
Well, it requires a lot of physical, emotional, and intellectual energy. It requires our brains to work hard.
Oh, God, yeah.
And that's why. So on any given day, we get some capacity of change fatigue. Did anyone do this past year where you just were so tired of making decisions of how many there were in a day, where you're just like, okay, well, cereal for supper because I don't even want to think anymore? That's
right. You were burnt out from the change in decision making. Yeah. And this will occur, change fatigue, when demands for adaptation, I want to say it better, adaptation, change to that change, it exceeds what you have in your capacity. Your tank doesn't have enough to make a successful change, and it can result in transition crisis and change-related dysfunction, which is what?
Well, change is any action or feeling that diverts resources away from progressing towards successful transition. And so just noticing, okay, so I want to come at this better, and a little bit have some strategies or things that, hey, I chose the best way forward. Right. Everybody wants to be responsible for choosing the best way forward.
And if we don't know what our resources are, it's also important that we consider what they are a little bit. Like, do we know that I have physical, financial, intellectual, relational, spiritual, emotional, psychological, and societal resources that I can employ to adapt to transition successfully?
I think everybody knows this, but just going through it and parsing it out and saying, okay, where's the part where I have the most certainty, or have the most control, or have the most freedom? Those parts are sometimes very liberating to find out. A lot of people have, oh, okay, no, this person can't, because there's so many of us in the same boat, but we're all driving different boats. Yeah. Some are having canoes, some have dinghies that are tied together with bubble wrap, right? Like we can't judge what boat someone is in.
And when we're all in the same storm.
Yeah, we are in the same storm, but let's consider the different boats.
Yeah, so just throw in the chat room if you could, which 1 or 2 of those resources did you have to adapt in order to transition?
So I'm going to talk to this in the chat room. Somebody had said, I don't have the same work interactions as many of those in the public works field, and I can't imagine having to find the energy to have this kind of consistent conversation supporting other grown people's feelings and fears on a daily basis. Self-care has to be essential for this kind of
we're just getting to the end of your little chat message there.
Oxygen mask, putting it on and helping yourself. And that's absolutely true. It couldn't be more true that we need to actually see each other in the boat that you are in,
right?
And then realize, okay, I don't have all of the gits and gadgets of a yacht.
So then that means related to those specific resources, which relational and emotional resources do you need to either find a different way to adapt, or it might be the case when we don't have the energy to navigate the difficult conversations in our workplace to actually find new resources. Is there another way people can support us Or do we need to check in with our EFAP as well just to navigate through? Or do we just have to find a new person to bounce ideas off?
Sometimes all of them. Whatever you do isn't working, try another thing. And that's a sign of resilience, trying another thing, right? Seeking support is a sign of resilience. I had a lot of clients that couldn't pay me. So they decided, like, can I barter with you? I have this. Do you want that? Can I do this for time? Yes. Like, getting creative about it gave them the freedom to say, okay, well, that's good. This will work. Right? When we didn't think it would before.
And when we're amid people who we are in circumstances where we're not coalescing because the change is too profound and we're not all on the same page, can we find more support for ourselves? This is where we need to find support for ourselves. And if we look here as a little person, if you remember the little people in the world who learn to tie their shoes, you all admit to being human people. And when you learn to tie your shoes, we're sitting in the front door on the stoop. We tie our shoes. The primary caregiver comes along and says, what are you doing? Oh, I tied my own shoes all by myself. And we learn, because then often we're lauded. Oh, good for you. What a big boy. What a smart girl you are.
Did it all.
You did it all by yourself. And it starts a program that says, should I be an individualistic person or individuated? And those two are different. Individuated will seek help.
Yes, individuated people will seek help. Individualistic people say, you're on your own. Pandemic is like made islands of all of us. And so that kind of thinking might not be helpful in adapting.
No. So when we need to encounter others who are causing us distress because perhaps we don't have the same change and transition themes going on, talk to somebody who can provide other insights is a really important task to do. And if not, we may encounter the effects of unsuccessful transition. Well, we went all the way back here. It looks like. I apologize for that.
That's okay. But we'll go to the chat room and just say, somebody has said it can be very time consuming and almost exhausting at times. There are times when it totally consumes your day and nothing else happens. And that couldn't be more true. People feel less productive right now. People feel like, okay, this is all I got done today was grocery shopping. Right. And it doesn't seem like, so when there's unwelcome effects of an unsuccessful transition.
Yeah, they're normal. These effects of an unsuccessful transition are quite normal. And in fact, if we look closely at them, I'm sorry, we're getting off track here on our slides, folks. Let's go back here. If we look closely at them, the physical and biological elements are unwelcome effects. Sometimes we experience loss of sleep, fatigue occurs, might have GI responses to the effects of change and unsuccessful transition. Accident risks increase. There's strains on work performance. People often want to quit jobs and get away. Yeah.
And there is a decreased immune function that happens just from being isolated in your home, perhaps, right? Like a lot of people have been on their own. A lot of seniors have been on their own. And so what happens is all those stress hormones need to go somewhere. That's why it's landing in the GI sometimes. It's landing in our immune function sometimes. But if
it can lead to this, right? Emotional.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So then the emotional and psychological aspects of unwelcome but normal effects of change occur. So dream disruption, you started mentioning that.
Yeah, a lot of doctors, and we know this now, right? Even there's a lot of famous medical people that are coming out saying there's a lot of sleep disruption, a lot of stuff like that. Loss of strategic thinking, depressive symptoms are here. What the fridge moments where you go into a room where you've been where before and you're like, I completely forgot my thought.
Yeah, or we do something stupid that we don't normally do and we judge ourselves for it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so stupid. And we've all done that.
Why do I keep doing this? Right.
But that's normal when we've been in a big change that was leading towards transition.
And those are just part of the symptoms that we're looking at when we look at the emotional and psychological factors that could be inhibiting successful and well transitions.
So, Ange, can we measure change in crisis?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
And we know how.
The nice thing about measuring it is that we can consider our homeostatic regulator in this. It's part of our measurement. When we're hungry or thirsty or tired, we seek food.
Yeah.
Drink.
That's called our
sleep.
Homeostatic regulator. And that's what our body naturally does. So when we crave
people or being around people who agree with us, we automatically, it's our homeostatic regulator saying, you need this.
It satisfies because our brains need each other. They actually need each other. So I'm going to point to the chat room again.
Okay.
We have seen a lot of fatigue and behavior that was abnormal from people we know and judging others because of it. Yeah, we don't know what's going on inside someone's brain. What gives one person comfort scares another person. What gives one person security, actually, the another person's interpretation is it stolen freedom or something?
It's different for everyone.
Yeah.
And knowing that it's different for everyone, we know that our body is not a fan of surprises. It's really interesting to feel like there's a surprise, something's changed. We didn't plan it nor want it.
Nope.
And all of a sudden, what happens? There's this reordering of our routines. And what happens? The need of stress throws our whole body into turmoil.
It shows up physically first, and then it starts to develop in the brain if someone is developing a mental illness.
Yeah, so we need to examine a little bit of our past as a key to our future. Taking a look at that, folks. We want to just reference, we're not going to take long on this, but this is an example of what some can do to assess the past as a key to a future. So is the past going to give us what we need when we see it? Are we able to put what's known as a lifeline workup in play? And that lifeline workup is basically an assessment of the good times and distressing times when we're exposed to change.
So what's the benefit of this then, Jim?
Well, I'll show you here. So the benefit is this, and folks, we'd love to have time to go through the whole thing here, but we're just going to point to it. When you chart some of the past changes in your life, it's often the case where you can say, I transitioned successfully or less successfully. And by knowing the past changes, we can then consider, what do I need to do for upcoming changes, and do I have the resources?
Yeah.
A quick example is when a person has starts a career. You see that high bump. It was pretty good times. And over here, you look at a sibling getting ill, or even basements flooding. Those are bad changes that resulted in transition that people didn't like.
Yeah, perhaps the first basement flood, the person felt like, oh, maybe, like that worked out okay. But the second one hit them harder because they didn't think it would happen again.
Yes.
So the expectation was there that this is fixed, it's done, but then it came back.
But you can do this on your own if you want to spend a lot of time, or you can look to the life change index scale, which helps us as well. This scale goes through a bunch of stressful life events that have a point value on them. And this point value is very important because we can only tolerate so many points of stress in our life before we get what?
Ill.
Yeah, and once we get ill.
So this is a life index that actually measures how much stress a person has had in their life, so that it can predict the likelihood of illness. And Di Williams did a great job here because it's very accurate.
Yeah, the higher your life index stress units is, the more likely we are to get ill. And this timeline is great.
Yeah.
You can do a complex one, you can do a simple one, or in fact, a simple one would be looking back to the 70s or 60s when I was born, looking at now some of the major changes. Or do we even need to measure, Ange, formally?
No, it's not a formal measurement. And the part of I love about this is that families are doing this around the dinner table and saying, hey, remember when you were what, and point to a specific time. How did you get through that?
How did you get through that?
What was in place? What kind of supports did you have? Did you feel supported? Are those people around anymore? Or did they change? Or how much has changed? What needs to be in place now? Those are all the things that get talked about during that timeline. Yeah. So judgment is a huge part of it, right? Like we need to really assess, is that judgment good for me? Is it good? Can I keep it to TV and not human life? Like the actual life that I, like, because we judge, like who's going to win on TV, or we make decisions.
Right.
But if we can avoid making full decisions about human beings, we'll
about self too.
About self too.
When we're going through change.
Yeah. Because we know that we need to consider some things during this transition. Yeah.
And some of the things to consider is that, like you've mentioned it, we're differing in our vulnerability to transitions. And we can often reach this crisis about 6 months after the change. And we saw it already 6 to 12 months.
Yeah. And that change involves interpersonal and other personal learning and unlearning. We've had to so being in mental health, Jim's had to unlearn a few things that he grew up with. I've had to unlearn a few things that I grew up with. It's called socialization.
Yeah.
And sometimes it doesn't really do the job.
It's not a viable belief anymore. So what do we need to unlearn? And the bottom says, remember the 2 levels of adaptation, right? Behavioral, which happens automatically many times. We can be cognitive about it, and then cognitive restructuring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're a child and you made the wrong decision, like for sure that doesn't deserve judgment.
True.
Yeah. And so building a new neural pathway to get myself not in the place of economic insecurity or emotional insecurity or health or hostile work environment.
Yeah.
Sometimes our own homes can be hostile work environments, right?
Yeah, because these are all inhibiting factors. If these factors are in play, and if we're in isolation, it's an inhibiting factor to moving forward into a successful transition. And I think, Ange, you've talked before about something that goes on in our brain that develops a neuropeptide when we're in isolation.
Yeah. So tachykinin, you can Google this, tachykinin.
Tachykynin. That's a spelling bee.
It's a neuropeptide that actually they've researched long enough because they use the correctional system to research the effects of that neuropeptide on our brain. And what it does cause is aggressiveness, and it causes what looks like as depressive symptoms. So that's what's happening in all of our brains when we are isolated. So I say to myself, whatever it is I'm saying to myself to build that new neuropeptide to say, we're going to make it through this. We got this. We're going to do this. We're going to come out knowing some things so we can strategize our way into an adaptation of successful transition.
And we won't judge you if you self-talk, as long as you don't judge us, and we're learning to not judge ourselves either. And a further inhibiting factor could be this poor transition management. So perhaps you've had no support or didn't prepare for the change, or the unrealistic time scales are in place. Like, next week, I'm going to be over this. No, it can't happen. Just like an architect building a beautiful building, it takes time.
Yeah. And one of the kind of the key things that people have used time is somebody in our life is just celebrating their 2nd COVID birthday. And they said, nothing, I don't want anything.
Yeah, skip it.
Because, and we can see the isolation has had its toll, right?
Quick example on that point too, Ange. So we know vaccinations are coming. There's a sense they might not come as rapidly as we want. So we can monitor pre-crisis that issue and prepare mentally.
Yeah. What if they don't? It's okay to think that way. That's not catastrophizing, but what if they don't? What plan can I put in that maybe my brain can associate with and feel relaxed about?
And you need time for fresh insights. That brain associating, getting relaxed gives you opportunity for fresh insights. And do consider any past successes in transition. Yeah. We've talked about that a bit already. So,
have they been lessened? Because if they have been, you need to acknowledge them now, right? Especially the young people growing up. Yeah.
We're going to talk about some strategies for you, and that's going to include micro goals to move from change to transition. The first one is understanding the cycle. The cycle is this: change we saw is inevitable, transition is intentional. So the cycle is it has to begin with the ending, which means I now recognize my loss of social interaction, recognize what's lost, and then we can start to move into the neutral zone, which is where that brain starts to develop its ability to sustain and recover.
Yeah, and it is developed that way, and it can be rapid for some people. Some people have an aha moment, but it usually happens while we're on the page of intentional adaptation.
Yeah, because
where we understand that's ended. Can I accept that? Be in the neutral phase. Can I not deny it? Because cognitive dissonance will be in the way of me moving forward in that intention as well.
Yeah, because then after we went through that neutral phase, the new beginnings is the next phase.
Yeah.
And like you say, if we have that cognitive dissonance, that's going to prevent us from enjoying the neutral phase where we're developing again and preparing for that recovery phase, which is our new reality.
And it is our new reality. If we stay too long in the denial, like, no, this isn't even happening, I don't even want to think about it. No, we're going to do this anyways. That's not a great adaptation strategy.
No, it's not.
Right? It's a good adaptation strategy to find the people around you that know, okay, this is how we want to get through this together.
Right.
And be on a better page.
Would you say, Ange, that once the change occurs, some of us expect the transition to organically happen without our input?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not happening then, because we're not doing it because of us.
Yeah.
And this is one of the strategies that is a winner for all of us, when we make the tiniest little micro goals, and we make a micro goal and it moves us forward to the next goal. But what are micro goals?
Well, they're manageable.
Yeah.
They seem ridiculous, but they're manageable. They're individualized, so they only fit you, and they're clear, concise, and certain. There's no ambiguity in a micro goal, correct?
Yeah.
And they're repeatable, meaning I can reuse it, and it's not overwhelming. Because we have been overwhelmed this year.
Sure
if we can kind of put in, one or two of us might have been overwhelmed this year.
Yeah, raise your hand if there was any days of overwhelmment.
Yeah.
And I want to mention, a micro goal is a goal so small you can't not do it, and it's so doable
that you can't fail at it.
Right. So is it manageable? And a quick example on micro goals, folks, could be this. We've talked to people who want to start reading, and they say, I want to read. I'm going to read 2 books before spring. Let's pick that number. Like, spring's coming. It's going to be March soon.
Okay.
Spring's March 21st. So, and then they find a week goes and we haven't been able to hit the goal.
Yeah.
What's going on there? The goal's too big. The body goes into resistance. Fail.
Yeah. And what does the body receive as the fail? Stress hormones. Because I can't even do that, right? So the stress hormones go off in the brain,
Right.
and they're the ones that are forming that new neurocircuitry that, no, I can't do anything. There's nothing accomplishable here.
Yes.
So let's change that program.
Yeah, bring it down, change it by saying, okay, how much do you want to read? Oh, I want to read half an hour a day. Oh, couldn't do that goal. Maybe that's too big. Let's make it micro, make it really small. Say, I'm going to read 5 minutes a day, or even 5 minutes on Wednesday this week.
Yeah.
Make it so small, it's impossible to not do it, and seems ridiculous.
Seems ridiculous.
But it's real.
But it's real. And the brain, what does the brain do when we do that?
Good question. So it adapts and says, success, victory, I'm adapting. I can build these neural pathways to the next goal, and the next goal, and the bigger goal.
And I love that, because I used this when I was working with clients, wherever it was in the past 30 years, and I didn't even know I was doing it, because it was really micro, and it seemed like, okay, well, let's just require patience. And that's what I tell myself. But now that I know that there's brain research behind it, and that actually is the way, I didn't think, oh, okay, I just flopped into that.
Right.
There was actually some science behind it.
It was intentional after all. It wasn't just by happenstance. So the last piece we'll just mention, and then we're done here, is, this new growth. Once we do that, make these small goals, they become big goals and big successes. We've exposed ourselves to change, been exposed unwantingly or wantingly. It doesn't have to be a bad change.
No,
it could be having a new baby or getting a new marriage.
Yeah, those things they need adaptation, and intentional adaptation as well. And if anyone who's gotten married has said, okay, are you going to do this? And I don't like doing that, right? They already don't start talking about the infrastructure needed to intentionally transition in an adaptive, good way.
Yeah, and it's new growth is so beautiful when it happens, and remembering transition doesn't just happen to you or the society. It happens to organizations, society as a whole, all of us, because we know change will be persistent. But intentional transition management is going to do what? It's going to
soften that journey and avoid transition crisis, and it will be part of your new resilience package. Once once there is some more new normal, right?
So change is inevitable. Transition is intentional. We know we have support of others in our world that we can take those small steps to stay well along the journey. Yes. There, we'll go and